Hi, I'm a goat, and have I goat a show for you. Goat, got, get it?
Show what you know. Hey, show what you know.
You had a great day at school with your teachers and your friends. And now you're home, hey, you should know the learning doesn't end. Share with your family just what you learned today. Pat yourself on the back, my friend, and shout out loud, hooray! Yeah, you can do it, come on!
Show what you know.
You're always learning and ready to grow.
Show what you know.
Curiosity is making you a pro.
Show what you know.
There's always so much more to know. So here we go, here we go. What did you discover and learn about today? Show what you know. Oh, here we go.
Listening. Listening means paying close attention to the sounds you're hearing. The elephant is listening to the hippo play the violin. The monkey is not listening.
We learned about letters, sounds, and words. Show what you know. Oh, here we go.
L. L.
I like how you look. You got a line up and down. You got another line along the ground. L, 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 you ring my bell. You start words like laugh. You start words like love. You start words like leaves in the trees above. L, 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 you ring my bell. You stand up real tall, you stand up real straight, and you don't get mad when I show up late. L, 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 you ring my bell. L, 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 you ring my bell.
U. Umpire.
much fun. Let's count along with everyone. Here we go.
Hat, hat, hat.
Boots, boots,
Hat,
boots.
hat. What comes next?
Here comes a story and it's guaranteed to be the kind of story that you like to read. Here we go.
The unusually shiny bright imagination of Georges. The author is Jane Strasbaugh. The illustrators are James Bravo and Russell Joswiak. There once was a boy named George, or Georges, because the boy was French. He lived in Paris a long time ago with his mama, papa, and his two brothers. Georges' papa owned a boot-making factory. Georges was born with an unusually shiny bright imagination. He kept it in a jar on a table next to his bed. During the day, Georges' imagination burned like the sun, and at night, it sparkled like the brightest star in the sky. But there was something unusual about Georges' imagination. Every time he used it, his imagination grew bigger and brighter. One day, Georges used quite a lot of his imagination to build a puppet theater out of old cardboard boxes. By the time he'd finished building the theater, Georges' imagination had grown so big, it nearly burst out of the jar. I have so much imagination now. I think I'll make puppets too, Georges exclaimed. Every morning, after he had dressed for school and eaten a breakfast of hot cocoa and a roll with butter and jam, Georges took his imagination out of the jar and tucked it into his school bag. Then, with a wave to his mama and papa, he walked down the boulevard, past the pastry shop, the grocer's shop, and the flower stall, turned right at the Eiffel Tower, and entered his school. Unfortunately, Georges was not a very good student. His imagination got in the way. During math lessons, his imagination would shine through a hole in Georges' school bag. So instead of doing his schoolwork, Georges would draw pictures of amazing places and animals and funny pictures of his teacher. Georges' teacher was not amused. He would wag his finger at Georges and say,
Georges, cut that out and pay attention to your schoolwork.
When Georges grew up, he took a job at his father's boot-making factory. Every day, he would tuck his imagination into the pocket of his jacket and go to work. Making boots was a good job, but it didn't use much of Georges' imagination. At lunchtime one day, Georges reached into his pocket and pulled out his imagination. He was surprised at how small and dim it had become. A terrible thought struck Georges.
When I use my imagination, it becomes bigger and brighter. Does that mean when I don't use it, my imagination becomes smaller and duller?
Georges ran into his father's office.
Papa, I cannot make boots any longer.
He declared.
I like making things, but making boots is shrinking my imagination. What will you make then, Georges?
His father asked.
Boots are beautiful and useful. Everyone must have boots.
Georges' papa was a practical man. Georges shrugged.
I don't know, Papa.
he said sadly.
But I must find something to make that will allow my imagination to grow bright again.
Kissing his father on both cheeks in the French way, Georges left the boot factory. It was a cold December day. The sky was gray. Smoke rose from the chimneys of Paris, and the air smelled of snow. Georges walked up and down the streets, thinking about what he could make. When he got to the river, he saw a row of boats tied up along the bank.
That's it! I'll make boats!
He cried.
Boats are beautiful and useful. Papa will be pleased.
He reached in his pocket and touched his imagination. It felt cool. Apparently, it had not warmed to the idea of making boats. Georges sighed.
All right, not boats,
he said. Georges walked on. When he reached the Grand Café, he stopped to have some lunch.
I'll think better with a bowl of onion soup and a ham sandwich in my stomach,
he thought. But the door to the cafe was closed. Georges peered through the window. It was dark inside, yet he heard the sounds of laughter and applause. So Georges went inside to find out what was happening. All the tables in the cafe had been pushed aside, and the chairs were arranged in rows, like a theater. Every chair was filled, so Georges stood in the back. Pictures began appearing on a screen at the front of the room. The pictures were of people doing ordinary things, walking their dogs, sitting on a bench reading a newspaper, buying flowers. What was unusual about the pictures was that the people in them were moving. Georges blinked and rubbed his eyes to make sure it wasn't his imagination playing tricks on him. But it wasn't. The people in the pictures were actually moving. One of them looked right at Georges and waved. What Georges was looking at was a movie. The first movie ever made. Georges clapped with delight. His imagination began to glow so brightly that it nearly burned a hole in his pocket. Georges knew, without a doubt, what he must make: movies. And so he did. Georges made lots of movies. Each movie used more imagination than the one before. Long before there were astronauts and rockets, he made a movie called A Trip to the Moon. He imagined what a spaceship might look like and built it. He designed a big gun to blast the spaceship into space. He pictured how the man in the moon would react to a spaceship landing on him and drew it. Georges made hundreds of movies. He used his imagination so often and so well that it never became small or dull again. In fact, it became so big and bright that it could no longer fit in a jar. So Georges built an extra room onto his house, just for his imagination.
Get on up and move around. It's good for you. Let's sing and get down. Oh, here we go.
Here we go. Head, shoulders, knees, and toes.
Knees and toes.
Head, shoulders, knees, and toes.
Knees and toes.
And eyes and ears and mouth and nose. Head, shoulders, knees, and toes.
That's my nose.
Take it, Scooter.
Head, shoulders, knees and toes.
Knees and toes.
Head, shoulders, knees and toes.
Knees and toes.
And eyes and ears and mouth mouth and nose. Head, shoulders, knees, and toes.
Yay! Good singing.
They sang very well, too. And they know different parts of their bodies.
They're very smart.
You said it, Curiosity.
Your family is proud of you, and curiosity is too. Now lift your star and watch it grow. Here we